What we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at those issues that Donald Trump talked about during the campaign. We're going to talk about the odds of those issues actually being put into place, or whether there's some nuanced version of them that might actually be enacted. We're also going to take a look at the upsides and the downsides of each. The single most important thing that you can do as a voter today, I don't care what side you were on, is to try and have political agency when looking at these issues. You're going to be making a lot of decisions in terms of what you're going to invest in, what you're going to do with your company, where you want your 401k funds to be put, or whether or not you're going to buy a new home. All of those things are going to be impacted by the public policy that's being put into place. Now, some people believe that Trump is going to have a nuanced view of all the things that he's spoken about. I tend to believe that he is going to take a view that's going to be to shoot for the fences. He's going to go for something that is much more extreme than what a traditional president might do. Either way, we're going to have a discussion about those issues and whether or not he's going to shoot for the fences or try a more moderate view. And more importantly, we're going to try to diagnose what the effect of those policies will be. We won't be able to get this done in one show. We're going to have to do quite a few where we continue to talk about it. But the single most important thing that I want to tell you, regardless of what side you were on in this past election, is that to remember, if you believe you're a real patriot, if you want to be a patriot, why don't you quit insulting other Americans? We all have a role of trying to build up people on the other side. And both groups had a right to their opinion, and both groups did the best they could to figure out who would be the best candidate from their perspective to be president of the United States. Now, I admit it, I'm just an ordinary optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. I am hopeful. I am hopeful that our new president is successful, because his success is going to determine our success. In any event, if you like what it is that we're talking about here, press that subscribe button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and dissect and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right. I'd like to welcome the panel back. We have Eliott Pollack. Eliott, welcome back today.
Good to be here.
Henry Thompson. Professor Thompson, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Paul. It's good to see you all this morning.
Great. All right. So let's see. We are now election day +2. It's Thursday, 2 days after the election. The election, it almost is unprecedented in terms of how big the results seem to be. In fact, I don't know that he'll win as big as what Joe Biden beat him by, but nonetheless, as a Republican president, he's won both the popular vote. He is going to be fairly close to where Joe Biden was at 300 plus delegates coming out of the Electoral College. And we also have what is going to be a Republican Senate, maybe a Republican House by the time that we're done. All the odds seem to be favoring that. So let's start with just kind of your take on the election. What do you think happened? And give me your prognosis for why it is that the Democrats lost so bad.
Well, I think that there were three reasons. There were a lot of reasons, but the three leading ones were, even though the economic data says things are great, the average person is saying, geez, I can't take my kids to Disneyland. I can't afford a house. I'm having trouble with the rent payment. I got to make my pickup truck last another couple of years. My quality of life has deteriorated over the last 4 years. I'm living hand to mouth, and I don't like it. And this was a great big, I don't like it to the Democrats, that they're focusing on the wrong things. I also think they're tired of the woke the woke stuff. They're worried about the guys being on girls' sports teams, as little as that. They just aren't happy with what they're reading and what they're seeing. And I also think they're concerned about where we are in the world and everything we're facing and are we prepared to. And things have, I think the general feeling is that things have significantly deteriorated over the last 4 years. I think the reason that a lot of people didn't see it, forget the left leaning of the news media, which was outrageous over the last several years. It's just that people were so beat up by, I think, by the Democrats, because the Democrats would never say, hey, I disagree with you on this, this, and this. Let's discuss it. You'd be called an idiot. You'd be called a misogynist. You'd be calling a racist. And people just didn't want to deal with that. So they kept their mouths shut until they got to the voting booth. And then they did open their mouth in the way they voted. I am both shocked and pleased at what I saw on Election Day. I agree with you, I agree with Bob, that it was the least of two evils, but at least they felt that Trump was delivering a message of hope instead of a message of hey, what are you worried about? There's nothing to worry about. And it's going to be, in terms of what's going to happen, we'll discuss that, but it's really way up in the air. But I think you can count on a lot of things that will help the economy in the near term very quickly.
I thought the election results were more resounding than I was expecting. Actually, I wasn't expecting Trump to win some of these swing states by such big margins. And my basic analysis is that Trump has been trying now for 8 years or more to put together what he calls a populist, nationalist, working class coalition, which cuts across race and gender and basically runs across a class divide, whether you measure that by income or by education. And he had some success doing that in 2016. And then obviously he didn't do so great, and the Republicans didn't do so great in the election since then. But somehow, and it could be about Kamala Harris as a candidate and the economic background of this election being so bad. But this working class coalition seems to have come together for Trump this time even more strongly than it did in 2016. And the divides across income and class and education are really stark, with Trump winning by more than 10 points across the college income divide, meaning people who don't have a college degree. I think it was like 56% to 43% or something for Trump. And there's just way more of those voters as well, right? So I think this is an interesting election because it does seem to hint that this structural transformation is continuing and that the Republicans do seem to be able to capitalize, or at least capitalize this week, on that shift towards the working class moving to the right.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I'm just looking at turnout. If you look at turnout, Republicans weren't far off of what they were in 2020. Democrats were below that, but the group that really dropped off in Arizona, I can't tell you that these are the definitive numbers because we're not done counting, but the group that definitely dropped off were independent voters. I also don't know if that's true outside of Arizona, but it is definitely true inside of Arizona. And to me, that's an interesting question as to why that took place. But we're going to be doing a lot more analysis on the actual race when people start getting numbers and polling and they have a better understanding of it. What I'd really like to spend most of our time talking about today is, where do we think that the Trump administration goes? And I'm going to start with this concept. The advantage to a political race is that there's pressure that always builds up on both sides. There was pressure, obviously, that was built up on the right side of the equation, partly because of economics, but I think it also has a lot to do with the woke issue. And as Eliott was talking about, it has to do with males feeling that there's something amiss economically, socially, on the cultural issues, on a wide variety of different topics. What an election does is it lets some of that steam out of the pipes. Now, you can bet steam is already beginning to build up on the other side, both amongst Democrats and by women. And over 4 years, or maybe it's 8 years. At some point in time, that steam will have to be let out of those pipes as well. But what the election does is it gives hope to both sides over the years, right? Because once you recognize that you can win, that you can be successful, you have hope. Now, sometimes that hope ends up dissipating when you feel like you don't get what you wanted over a 4-year period of time. But it's how we've avoided any type of violent revolution. The good news is one side is going to feel like they won today. All right, it wasn't the candidate that I selected, but that's not the point. Good news is one half of America, a little more than half of America, is going to feel like they have hope, that somebody is there that delivered to them. Now, in that process, I think that it's interesting to think about what he's going to do long term to be able to try to deliver on that promise. And I want to start with something that's a little bit innocuous, but I do think it was important in the campaign. And that's people that he's surrounding himself with. Gabby Giffords, Robert Kennedy, Elon Musk. All three of those people were signals to people on the other side, on the Democratic side, or in the entrepreneurial community, that he was going to be doing something differently. I'd like to talk a little bit first about those three people. Do you think that they really end up getting a role in the administration? And are they able to make much of a difference? RFK, there's talk about putting him in charge of things that would deal with things like vaccines. Elon Musk, they're talking about putting him in charge of trying to reduce regulations. I think that Elon Musk, the idea that he's going to cut $2 trillion out of the budget, I'm doubtful. I think, well, you start with the budget. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense end up making up somewhere near around 70% of the budget. Unless you're really willing to cut entitlements or defense, I don't know that that's going to be successful. I think that Elon could play two roles that would be interesting. One role would be reducing regulations. The idea, regulations play a two-front role. One role is certainly they increase the size of the federal budget somewhat, but I don't really think it's as much as people think. However, it does work as a governor to the economic engine because it slows down economic progress by the private sector. That's an area I think he could actually have a bigger effect. The other area might be playing the Tony Stark rule where he is taking a look at our defense budget and maybe more importantly, taking a look at, are we going to keep building $1 million missile or counter missiles to defend against drones, which cost in the tens of thousands of dollars? Certainly, technology can play a role there that could make a difference, and maybe he could play a bigger role in that. Eliott, your thought on Elon Musk and RFK?
Well, will Musk be doing this on a day-to-day basis? I hope not, because there are too many other things that would benefit humanity that he should be spending his time on. However, I do think he would be the perfect person to look at regulations and see if they are useful or not. I forget how many regulations there are, but they're in tens of thousands. And most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, a lot of them are a waste of time. I can tell you from businesses I've been in, they do increase costs and they increase delivery time significantly, and they need to be dealt with. Military, it's about time somebody took a hard look at the military, whether they have enough money or whether the money is being allocated to the wrong place or they need more money. Maybe he's the guy to do that. I don't know. But certainly with regulation, I'm optimistic. RFK, I think just Trump's looking for a place to put him in a corner somewhere and that he has something to do. And whether he's successful or not, I have no idea. But I do think in general that Trump learned his lesson in 2016 about not being prepared and not having the right guys around him. And I think this time it'll be a lot smoother than it was last time. And he'll hit the ground running a lot more than he did 8 years ago.
Eliott, let me continue on this line. What I'd like to do is I'd like to flip to economic issues. There are a whole series of reforms that Trump has proposed on economic issues. At the top of the list is the issue of tariffs. What I'd like to do on tariffs for a moment is to think about two things. One, he's talked about a 10% tariff across the board. What probability would you give him of actually doing that? Number two, what I'd like to ask you is there are obviously alternatives. The alternative would be to just use the tariff strategically when you were trying to harm somebody on the other side, or to do a lower tariff. But the second question that I'd really like you to focus on is, let's say that he did go the entire distance of implementing a 10% tariff across the board. If you were to look at that economically, who are the winners and who are the losers in that situation? Who benefits from it and who loses from it?
It's not a static decision, so it's very difficult to say. I think the very first thing he's going to do is give people, other countries, an opportunity to drop their tariffs. And so I don't think it'll be 10 or 20 or whatever you want to say percent across the board. I think he'll use it as a potential weapon to get countries to not have tariffs on the U.S. that are higher than the U.S. has on them. I also think that he will use it against our enemies, potential enemies, especially China, and that will have an effect on goods that are imported from China. But at the same time, the tax cuts that he's talking about, the corporate tax cuts and income tax cuts, are clearly going to spur the economy in fairly near term. And so I think there are offsets, and it's very difficult to say if he just implemented a 10 or 20% tariff and nothing else happened. Obviously, that's going to raise costs. My expectation is it'll be used more as a weapon to get other countries to play ball, and as a weapon against China, who is, well, it used to be the saw about tariffs were that, look, it doesn't matter if China and Japan and Indonesia are going to send us computers and TVs and telephones, and we're going to send them green pieces of paper. But ultimately, the money has to cycle back to the U.S. So ultimately, the balance has to be zero. And so if China spends it somewhere else, that country will spend it here. But what's happening now is our own money is being used as a weapon against us. China is buying America, millions of acres of farmland. They're buying into corporations that somehow they control, and those corporations end up moving their manufacturing to China as vis-a-vis Westinghouse, or I forget the name of the company that makes all the important magnets in the world. That's now in China. And so China is taking our money and using it against us. That has to stop. And that's really more important than a 10% tariff on goods from Europe. It's more important as a national defense issue. And I think people are totally overlooking that.
All right. So I'm going to push you on this. One more question. So I've been listening to Trump for a long time, and he is definitely a believer in tariffs. I think that the whole America First agenda tends to revolve around this idea that we don't need everyone else. We don't need immigrants. We don't need goods from outside groups. That if we don't have them being made here today, we can start making them here. So it seems to me that the winners and losers in a tariff situation, I could be wrong. I'd love your economic input on this. Let's say we ended up in a full-blown trade war. The losers of that, it would seem to me, are companies that are looking to export product, right? And then that would include big companies like Google and Facebook and other companies who are being able to sell their services offshore. The winners in that, though, would be companies who were selling product internally, who were making product, selling that internally. So a steel manufacturer may benefit from it. An automobile manufacturer may benefit from it, knowing that they're going to have less competition to sell to here internally, or at least the competition is going to have to pay a higher price. Now, I'm not a believer. I mean, I tend to follow more of a free market concept, but even saying that, I can't imagine that there aren't upsides to some companies in a full-blown trade war if it did take place. Your thoughts
Well,
on that?
again, keep in mind that if there's a trade war, we're going to be importing less, so the domestic market's going to be larger for those people who tend to export. And also keep in mind that prior to 1913, most of the revenues for the federal government came from tariffs. There was no income tax. So it's not something that's never happened before. And I'm going to be interested to see whether or not he plans on covering any cuts in income taxes with increased tariffs. Are some companies going to be hurt and some companies going to flourish? Absolutely. I can't tell you right now which ones they are. It depends on how they react. It depends on where the tariffs are. It depends what people who we put those tariffs are do to retaliate. Depends on a lot of things. But it is different, and it's got the potential to get out of hand, which is what you're talking about, or it's got the potential to work and change the nature of things. America first, that's obviously Trump's major agenda. But keep in mind that everything he did the first until COVID hit caused the economy to boom during that period of time. And most importantly, and this is the major thing that cost Harris the election, cost real incomes for the average family to go up, as opposed to the Biden administration, where real incomes for families declined. And so I'd say that for me, the jury's out. It depends on what he does. It depends on where the tariffs are and how people react. And it also depends on whether he's going to focus on China or just do it across the board and see what happens. He can't do it. There's got to be a quid pro quo. If you're raising tariffs, you sort of have to cut taxes to offset that.
The tariff issue in general cuts in the way that it helps non-traded industry and firms, and it helps what we call the non-abundant factor of production, and it harms trading firms and what we call the abundant factor of production. So in America, for example, what that means is that the abundant factor of production here is capital and high-skilled labor. So relative to low-skilled labor and non-traded industries, high-skilled labor and capital-intensive industries are going to suffer. That means that things like Wall Street is going to do worse. Highly capitalized high-tech industries, like, for example, a lot of the tech industries are going to do worse. And the industries that are going to do better are the industries that rely more on the more scarce factor of production. And in the US, that is labor. So labor is going to do better under a more restrictive trade regime than it would otherwise, for the simple reason that it's very simple to understand this, that America's labor is not abundant because it's way more expensive than elsewhere in the world, right? It's way cheaper to get people to work for you in China than it is in the United States. So a tariff that moves more production into the US is going to help labor. But the other interesting aspect of this is the traded versus non-traded sector. So, for example, even though healthcare, it's not like we've been importing a lot of healthcare, because other parts of the economy are going to do worse. Healthcare, which is a non-tradable sector generally, right? You can't really get healthcare overseas. It's not that you can, but not a lot of people do it. Sectors like healthcare and other services that are really hard to export are going to do better. So if you think about Trump's agenda to help, and the coalition that he's put together, this low-income working class coalition, that's labor. So labor is the scarce factor in the United States that's going to benefit from these tariffs. And B, the tradable or non-tradable sector. The non-tradable sector employs a lot of low-skilled labor as well. People like, small business owners, they're not engaged in international trade, or relatively low-skilled jobs. I just mentioned hospitals, hospitality, all sorts of things like that, cleaners and things like that. Relatively, they are going to do better compared to other sectors of the economy under a more closed trade regime. But of course, that's this distributionary effect of winners versus losers. There's also the main effect, which is just it's going to be worse for the economy overall. So what's going to happen is the economy is going to grow less than it would otherwise. But within that shrinking pie versus an open trade regime, the non-traded sector and labor are going to do better than they would under an open regime, and they're going to do better than capital and high-skilled labor. So this this policy that he's pursuing matches perfectly with his political coalition, which is against highly skilled, quote unquote elites. It's very populist, but the problem with it is the low growth factor. And if Trump really does hamper economic growth in the long run through this restrictive trade regime, he's not going to be able to get around that by the fact that he's at the margin helping low-skilled workers, etc. But I would say that the growth effects are probably in the long run, and the other effects are maybe a little more short run. And so he might get away with it for 4 years, right, until the next election comes and he's out of office.
My read of Donald Trump is, and this is charitably, is he likes to shoot for the fences. Now, other people might look at that and say he's willing to be more radical on his agenda. But either way, he's looking for a big legacy move, something that creates a dramatic shift in the body politic. And that dramatic shift is being able to get those low-wage workers solidly into the Republican Party. I think, my own personal opinion is, it is absolutely possible he could just go play this on the margins and go do tariffs only in China. But I'm just reading this purely from a political standpoint. I think politically, he's going to do exactly what he's told us he's going to do. He's going to look at a 10% tariff. He may give relief to some groups who give relief back to us, but I think he actually would like to see an economy that was more governed on a protectionist basis. I think that fits his political agenda. Because of that, I'm deeply interested in who are the winners and who are the losers. What companies should we be investing in? What areas of the economy should we be investing in? If that's what we think our projection is.
I do think that you have to pay attention, that he has to pay attention to real incomes. And if what you're suggesting it happens, prices are going to go up and real incomes are not going to go up. And that's his weakness. And I think he knows that. So I'm assuming that he's going to apply some common sense here, that if it works, great, but if not, we got to change the game.
And I would say, being a believer from a political standpoint, short term, maybe midterm, makes sense. I do believe that a lot of people who I'm speaking to who voted for Trump on this tariff issue believe what Eliott believes. They believe he's just going to be reasonable, that he's too smart to buy into it 100%. My reason for believing that he's going to buy into it for 100% is because there is a political advantage to. He shifted the political map. That political map he was able to win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I would argue that the tariffs helped him big time in those states. Just because of what Henry was saying earlier, it helped them because that is a pro-labor issue. That's an issue that will help especially labor groups like steel production, as opposed to producing airplanes like Boeing, right? If you want to be able to produce the types of products that export products all over the world, protectionism doesn't help. But if you're only interested in protecting your own market, it does. And it creates a massive political shift. Now, let's move a little bit. Eliott, do you have any hope from him? And if you do, why? Do you have any hope from him that will actually see a reduction in deficit spending? Maybe not a balancing of the budget, but a reduction in deficit spending. And again, if you do believe that, why do you believe that?
I think that that would be a long shot. That the ability of doing everything he wants to do and getting a reduction in the budget deficit is going to be difficult. He can do some things. He can do away with the inflation, the rest of the stuff from the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, I think there'll be a revenue flow from tariffs, but I think he needs to cut taxes to keep people happy about that. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult.
Do you see the deficit going up from Joe Biden, staying the same as Joe Biden, or actually reducing? And again, I'm not talking about the balancing the budget. I'm just talking about the actual deficit spending.
$2 trillion a year, I would think that he should be able to keep it at that level or slightly lower, but it's whatever number he comes up with is going to be too high. Just like if Harris had won, whatever number she came up with is ultimately going to be too high. How do these things work out? Well, again, right now we're getting a free pass because we're the world's reserve currency, but ultimately it's not going to work out. But I can't tell you whether that's 10 minutes from now or 10 years from now.
Are we seeing any resistance or friction coming from the people who are buying our bonds? I was hearing beforehand, before the end of the election, we were, and I didn't know how truthful that was or how much it was just geared towards trying to put pressure on or trying to focus on why Biden wasn't the right president.
It was about 3-4 months ago. There was a very short window when we couldn't get enough bids to cover the bonds, and that went away pretty quickly. And it normally would have been fixed by basically paying more. Again, the price of bonds would have increased to get people to buy them. Will the type of thing you're talking about happen? Eventually, but there has to be a different place for the world to go, and it's not China, it's not Europe. I'm not sure exactly what takes over for the dollar, but sooner or later we will have gone too far. If you would ask me 10 years ago, would it happen if you were running deficits as large as we are for as long as we were? I would have said, boy, that's going to be tough to swallow. But the world did. I just don't know at what point it becomes a problem. But I will tell you at some point it will be a real problem. And so if I'm Trump, one of the things is historically, the only way out of these things is to inflate your way out. That won't help Trump at all. That politically, that will hurt him. And the other thing he can do is try to basically lower the value of the dollar. And those are really his two choices if he's going to continue running $2 trillion deficits.
How does lowering the value of the dollar help on the deficit spending?
Well, it makes our goods cheaper, so we look better. So overall, we'll be selling more overseas.
Gotcha. All right, so let me shift the agenda just a little bit. Let's go to the America First agenda. So the people who are in the America First movement, they have this sense that we shouldn't be playing the role that we've been playing around the world in trying to protect what we have considered to be American interests. They think all American interests are right here at home, and they're the only ones that we should be focused on. Now, in the short term, I think they've been more supportive of Israel. But I think if you really look at the sentiment long term, it's not just about Ukraine. It's not just about NATO. It ends up becoming about Taiwan, and for that matter, the Middle East. It's a belief that the United States just shouldn't be the policeman of the world. Now, I don't know how far Trump goes on that. He seems to be bought in fairly strong to the America First agenda, and he has some people like Ramaswamy and others who are around him who are deep believers in that concept. Where do you think that goes? Does he rationally just start to become an American president that recognizes you have to balance those interests out? Or do you think that he actually begins to withdraw from certain commitments that we've had around the world? Henry, I'll start with you.
Again, I would say that this agenda kind of melds with his coalition, because if you're moving away from high-skilled and tradable industries in your tariff policy and your economic policy, then you're also going to be less willing or focused on defending those interests abroad, right? Which is where a lot of America's military and foreign entanglements come, is from America's commercial role abroad and wanting to be able to guarantee freedom of the seas and all these other things. So America withdrawing from the rest of the world to a certain extent is implicit in his economic policies, but also in the political coalition he's putting together. And so I do think that some of that will happen, but the question is where. I think that there's a big looming issue here, which is China, and there is a bipartisan, really strong support for more opposition to China and the United States, even within the America First coalition, I would say. China sort of has a special role. So what I would predict is that allies in Western Europe, for example, are probably going to have to stand on their own 2 feet a little more. The support for NATO will continue to be, under Trump, weaker than before. But I wouldn't be surprised if actually the American support for allies in Southeast Asia and in East Asia might stay the same or even increase as the focus turns to be more on China. Israel, I think, probably also occupies a special position and will probably continue to see significant support. But it seems to me it's more the transatlantic aspect of America's foreign policy that is under threat from Trump rather than other aspects of it.
I think that part of the America First agenda, whether they intentionally want to or not, it is going to reduce the view of the United States around the world. That doesn't mean they won't see us as being strong. That doesn't mean they won't see us as still being an incredible military force. But I don't think that they're going to necessarily see us as a dependable ally. Certainly, I think in Europe, if he progresses on the way that he has been talking about, or in China. I hope Henry's right on China, that there's such a bipartisan support that that's what he would do, but that's not my read. I'm interested in Israel and your thoughts on Israel. And let me give you my read, and you feel free to dispute this. So my belief is that in the short term, Trump will be beneficial to Israel. It'll be beneficial to Israel because it's going to push back on Iran. But long term, I just don't see Trump as being willing to engage in a long-term confrontation in the Middle East. Maybe less so than any president we've had in American history. And consequently, which, by the way, I think a number of Americans not only agree with him on that, they look at places like Afghanistan and they say the evidence says that's not where we should be. Consequently, I'm not going to be the only one that knows that. I think Iran is going to know that. They're going to know that we don't want a long-term confrontation. Now, I think they're going to continue to focus on their proxies as opposed to doing it themselves, hoping that that becomes a distraction for us. It seems to me Israel is already starting to wise up to this, not only by their desire to create a coalition with Saudi Arabia, but there's lots of talk now about Israel and Turkey doing the same thing. And now today they're not. They're enemies today. But if they could create a coalition, it would empower Turkey as well as creating a safer haven for Israel. The real point is this. Do you think that Israel long-term is going to be able to depend upon the United States as being the force that creates the right check on Iran, or are they going to have to do this themselves and maybe we're more dependent upon them? And then certainly you can answer the other questions that also exist or that were asked about the United States military and what's going on in the other parts of the world.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with your next to last statement, in that the U.S. has a long history of sending American troops to die in foreign lands for other countries. Israel never asked for that. Israel is defending itself with its own troops, with its own military, and that's a completely different situation. Yeah, we're sending them armaments and all that good stuff, but no guys, nothing that's going to cause a draft or Americans to die. And I really think that Netanyahu basically had two great things from his standpoint happen. One, he got rid of his defense minister who wanted to settle up and basically go back almost to the way it was, which would be insanity for Israel in the long run, in my opinion. And two, Trump is likely, at least in the near term, to be much more favorable to Israel than Biden was. And Biden kept on trying to blackmail his way into getting them to do what they want by saying we're going to delay the shipments of armaments that you need to continue this battle. I think in the near term, Israel just not only will go for it in terms of Lebanon, but I think they're going to go for it in terms of Iran. And Iran is there's always provocations, and one day they'll go too far, and that'll be the end of Iran's oil fields and the end of their nuclear program. If the one thing that Israel has shown is they can get to anything in Iran whenever they want, and they've been held back, I think, until now. But I think that Israel will do more on its own to try to get to the coalition that you're talking about and to destroy Iran's capabilities militarily. So I'm not worried about the long run. I'm worried about the next year or two, because I think that's all it'll take.
Yeah, I forget who it was that said the long term doesn't matter.
Yeah, Keynes. Yeah.
In the short term, Israel will do a good enough job, but I think Israel's going to face the same thing the rest of our allies are going to face, and that is they're going to have to go find new allies. Now, most people, again, I think would say Trump's going to be a supporter of Israel, but the question is, what does that mean? What does that actual mean in terms of its deployment? If the answer is we'll go assassinate some military leader, yeah, I buy in. I buy in that we'll do that. If the answer is will we land troops there, it's not going to happen. And again, I think long term that's something that the Iranians know every bit as well as the Israelis and every bit as well as we do. I'm not even as convinced that he's going to be willing to put ships into harm's way the way that Biden did. Those were two big major aircraft carriers that you shouldn't have lost on what the benefits were to Israel of those aircraft carriers being there, because many of those missiles that were shot down by them. I think the whole world is going to be in a position where, at least today, they're thinking about how do we need to restructure our alliances? Who's going to be there to protect us and what's going to work? And some of that can be beneficial and some of that can be harmful. Henry, your thoughts on it?
I think that's certainly the case with Europe. You already see them actually having discussions about restructuring their security commitments. This has been going on for a while in Europe, and so I think that will just continue the trend. I think also it's not just Trump's withdrawal from NATO, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine came as such a shock to the Europeans that they are being compelled to respond. Countries like Germany talking about rebuilding their military capacity, etc. Of course, it's really unclear what the long-run consequences of a remilitarized Germany in the middle of Europe are. We'll leave that for another day. But I do think that that's happening in Europe. I'm not an expert enough on the Middle East, honestly, to give strong predictions, but my expectation would be that Trump would return to these Abraham Accords, the diplomatic path that he was trying to follow in his previous term to create a sort of a alliance with Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states along with Israel. That would be my expectation, that he would probably pursue similar policies to support Israel as he did before militarily. And as a couple of you mentioned, these sort of targeted strikes, he seemed to be quite happy with those during his first term, but that he would try and reinvigorate the Abraham Accords. I think that's an interesting potential component of what he will do in the Middle East moving forward. But again, I don't really know enough about the Abraham Accords and what's happened with those states since the end of the first Trump administration to know whether there's much of a chance that that type of a diplomatic strategic alliance could be developed along with the new Trump administration.
So I'll give you an interesting one. We have a family member of ours who came to the Halloween party. She'd gone in to vote. Beautiful lady, but very much a Trump supporter. And what I found to be fascinating was a conversation that was happening that said that that she felt like she was being harassed because she was being asked for 2 forms of ID inside when she went in to cast her vote. And she felt like they were just picking on Republicans. 2 things that came from that conversation. I didn't say anything to her, but the first one was she didn't recognize it was Republicans who had passed that rule. That's the first one that was there. And that you can't just ask for people who look brown for 2 forms of ID and not people who look white for 2 forms of ID. And she didn't say that, but obviously if you believe in providing 2 forms of ID, everybody should have to provide it. But the second thing that is clear to me is all these rules that they go past, I haven't seen them really helping Republicans. At the end of the day, the Republicans can come out and vote every bit as much as Democrats can. And what this last election proved is they can come out in greater numbers than Democrats can. If you go appeal to them, democracy works. And while I may have disagreement with the Trump administration and things that he's done, I have incredible agreement with the political system that we have today. I tip my hat to the people who won. They worked hard. They came out to vote. They came out to vote in larger numbers, and they're getting the candidate that they wanted. It works.
It's not about any particular election. It's about the structure of every election. And if you need to show an ID to get a glass of alcohol or to get on an airplane, why should you not have to show an ID for the most important thing you do as an American citizen, which is vote? And I know each state's going to do its own thing, but showing an ID is one way to clean up election fraud, if there was election fraud, but certainly it strikes me as something that's basic to the system. Yeah, I'm not just going to take your word for who you are. You've got to show something that shows me that you are who you are and that you're registered and blah, 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 and then go vote and let the chips fall where they may. And so it's more about the structure of the voting than anything else to me.
You know, Eliott, the only thing I would argue with you on that is, I don't know if you ever saw that movie, What About Mary? There's this great line where this killer gets in the car with the comedian, and he says he's got this new invention, and the new invention is 2-minute abs, right? Instead of the right. And the guy goes, well, gosh, 2-minute abs, if that would work, and that's going to be a great hit, why don't you go to 1-minute ads? And the guy goes nuts. He goes, that'll never work. You can only have 2-minute ads. I think we should have to have ID, but if we, why not 3 forms of ID? Because they're not trying to go to 2, why not 4 forms of ID, right?
Well, yeah, that, it gets carried away. 2 forms is, I'm in the 1 form. Just show me your driver's license and show me that it says you're a citizen. That's just something that shows that you have the right to vote. And then, fine.
And that's my argument with the reform of sometimes in the reforms, I don't think Republicans help themselves. I believe you should have to show ID. I don't want people cheating. I think by the way, I think Arizona is the model for the country in terms of how to run an early ballot campaign. I think we do it better than anyone else. And there's all kinds of evidence for that. I can't stand the idea that you can harvest ballots, that somebody can go pick up your ballots and take them in and drop them off. My view of that concept is you are asking for cheating to take place. So certainly cleaning some things up makes sense. But if we can, let's go back to the 2 big questions. Here were the 2 big questions that I was trying to ask. The first one is, do you see him as weaponizing the Justice Department? And he has said that he was going to, but is that just hyperbole? Is that something that he was talking about to annoy the other side and doesn't do? And then the second issue is, do you think that there's some advantage to democracy itself from the fact that he won, and that he probably will be less adamant about trying to overturn it? This is his last election, regardless. So
I think Trump is going to have all sorts of plans for the federal bureaucracy and the federal judiciary. And I think that a lot of them are probably going to be pretty disruptive. And a lot of people, especially people in DC, are going to be quite alarmed at what's going on. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw full-scale reform of some of the intelligence agencies. I wouldn't be surprised if there was significant reform of the FBI. And I wouldn't be surprised if, yes, there was a lot of turnover at a lot of agencies, including the Justice Department, but at other places as well, because as we discussed here on the show before, there are multiple organizations that have agendas for this kind of reform that are aligned with the Trump campaign, and they also have been recruiting people to staff these jobs for a long time. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that that's not going to happen. I think that to some degree that's going to happen. And then on the question of democracy, turnover is good. That's how the system works. People have to have the hope or the knowledge that if they lost this time, they can win next time. So turnover is good. There are regimes out there that have elections, but the trick is they never lose, and that's not a democracy. So turnover is good on a basic level. Whether your party won or lost on any given time is obviously a completely different question, but turnover is good, and divided government sometimes is also good to provide checks and balances. So, yeah, from the level of democracy, I don't know whether it's good that Trump won, but it's good that there's turnover.
All right, let me ask you, the first thing is, the Justice Department and the FBI are already weaponized. It's a question of where those weapons are going to be used and who the personnel are. That's a shame, but that has happened. It would be nice to get it back to some even flow. And I'm not sure that Trump isn't going to go too far the other way. Time will tell. I also am a great believer in what Henry said, and that I actually believe that term limits are necessary in this country, that the same people shouldn't be in Congress for 40 years, that it prevents the flow of fresh ideas. And I'm also a great believer in that in today's world, the best government is a split government. And we're not going to have that for the next 2 years. We'll probably have it the 2 years after that. But it's very difficult for Trump to cajole the system that allowed him to become president the second time.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely agree with the split government. And by the way, I agree with that regardless of whether it would have been Harris that won or Trump that won. A split government at least makes it more difficult for them to spend money. And if you were to ask me, I still think the single biggest threat that we have to our democracy is our budget. Our budget is way out of whack. And as you said earlier on the show, Eliott, I don't know when it's a problem, but I know that it's going to be a problem. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you guys and joining in the conversation.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.